We're expecting. Not that kind of expecting. That's the theme at RCPC here this Advent. You've probably seen it if you got your copy of the newsletter this week or if you ordered an Advent kit to have delivered to your home. The birth story in Luke's gospel has to do with expecting babies. And so we're drawing on and playing with that theme over these 4 weeks together. But don't worry, this is not just a 4-week sermon series on pregnancy and childbirth and early infancy concerns. This is a deeper dive into each of us to consider what expectations are we carrying in our own lives right now. What do we hope for and long to be possible individually, as a church, as a community? And maybe even more importantly, what expectations does God have for us that we can't even see yet as possible? Today's story is one that is entirely unexpected. It's the transformation of sacred rhythm and ritual into once upon a time. Ordinary duty converted to gospel encounter. You know about once upon a time. It's the normal moment when it is infused with something mysterious, magical, or mythical. All of a sudden, the stakes are heightened. Our senses are on high alert. There is great peril ahead and also a chance beyond our imagining for something to happen. Like when Tinkerbell sprinkles fairy dust on the head of Wendy and her brothers, and all of a sudden they can fly to Neverland. Or the moment when Cinderella lays weeping into the ashes and looks up to find the magical presence of her fairy godmother. The instant when Peter Parker is bit by that radioactive spider and he's no longer just a mild-mannered newspaper boy anymore. Or when Gandalf the Grey knocks on the door of the home of the young hobbit Frodo Baggins. It's Mary Poppins descending on her umbrella to the front door of the home of Jane and Michael Banks. Luke sets it all up. You got this aging priest, Zechariah, and his wife, Elizabeth, who's also a daughter of a priest. If there was ever a couple who was pure in the sight of God, it was this one. Luke makes it clear, drops in these words like righteous and blameless. But there's a problem. Elizabeth is barren, and Luke, ever polite, points out that they were both getting on in years. They're old. Retirement on the horizon. Might be Zechariah's last trip to Jerusalem to perform his priestly duties there. The handles of his knives for the sacrifices are worn with use. His priestly vestments faded and always smelling of flesh and ash, no matter how many times they've been run through the wash. Elizabeth has quit dyeing her hair, let it go gray. Silver, she likes to call it. No need to deny the reality of aging. They'd kept the Torah laws, they'd said their prayers, remembered the Sabbath day, but no children. In Zechariah and Elizabeth's world, that could be interpreted as God's judgment. They tried not to talk about it. They tried not to think about it. Just keep the routine, punch the clock, make sure the people continue in the practices of holiness. Maybe the other priests would give the old man an engraved pocket watch or something for all of his years of faithful service. And just as we're getting acquainted with this older couple, with their comfortable wrinkles and their arthritic movements, Luke moves the story along with this word, once. Pretty ordinary word. It just means one time. There was this one time. It was this time of Zechariah the priest's cohort to go to Jerusalem for the incense offering. Record tells us this is the evening offering, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There were so many priests at this time that different cohorts were sent to Jerusalem only twice a year for 2 weeks of service to do what they needed to do. Among that group, the priests who'd never had the chance to perform the duty of the incense offering, they would line up and they'd draw straws to see who would get the honor of performing this sacred task. And so Zechariah got in line to draw his straw, looking sheepish and, in fact, a little pathetic. Man, this old, all of these years of service, had never had a chance to enter the Holy of Holies and perform this sacred task. A loyal man, a man of duty, but not the kind of guy who caught many breaks. And finally, Zechariah draws the right straw. It's a glimmer of hope into the gray. And you heard it as he goes in to perform the rites of his duty. This once event becomes once upon a time. The angel Gabriel, who stands before the face of God. Zechariah would know who Gabriel was from the prophecies of Daniel, and yet Zechariah stands there petrified. No amount of holiness, no amount of righteous living, no amount of perfect keeping of the commandments could prepare him for this moment. He isn't just startled, he's paralyzed, he's frozen in place. Zechariah, realizing that long ago he had resigned himself to a life of once, going through the motions with no expectation, no true possibilities that there could ever be a once upon a time. Gabriel speaks. Gabriel offers Zechariah the promise of a child. This echoes the stories of the Hebrew people, Abraham and Sarah with Isaac, Jacob and his beloved Rachel, who is barren, the mother of Samson, Hannah and her son Samuel, a child of promise to be born. Zechariah knows these stories. Zechariah has taught these scriptures. He's lived them in Passovers and annual festivals. Now this story is unfolding with him. But when you spend your whole life worn down by all the daily activities, once we did this, and once we did that, when you've endured, once we hoped for, and it never happened, and you steeled your heart to the pain, it's awfully hard to think that once upon a time is possible. Zechariah is a person of logistical planning and clear thinking, a man of rhythm and routine. He'd probably graduate with high marks from Virginia Tech today. So he reverts to that mind that's trained in his logical thinking, and he asks Gabriel, how can this happen? Can you imagine Gabriel in this moment? Hovering above the earth, wings unfurled and flapping, in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place of the temple, at the time of the incense offering, a duty reserved for maybe once in a lifetime for any priest, promising life into a situation of barrenness, the oldest story of the covenant of the Hebrew people. And Zechariah is asking for a copy of his resume, for his 7-point plan, for his gynecological credentials. When we get stuck in the once, that's what happens. We can't even see the amazing works when they're happening before our very eyes. Perpetually entrenched in the now and the next. So Gabriel silences Zechariah. It sounds like a punishment for a stupid question. But maybe the angel knows that once upon a time takes a while to reawaken within a deadened soul. Something greater than words of explanation must do its work. And it does. Elizabeth conceives, and she feels the stirring of life in her womb, and the old woman begins to consider perhaps she is part of the grand salvation story of God. While her husband is struck mute, she is given lines of praise to the giver of life, this renewal of purpose, this hope she bears into being. She begins expecting what was previously unexpected once upon a time. Zechariah and Elizabeth show us the importance of the rhythms of worship, faithful living, righteousness, and obedience, that it's right there in those ordinary moments that God intervenes. Now, Zechariah shows us it doesn't mean we're ready when God shows up in those moments. We can be lulled into complacency in those regular rhythms of worship and prayer and service, but that is still, we see here, where the divine presence meets us, calling us to become someone we couldn't think we'd ever be. Kathy Fletcher and David Simpson were getting on in years. They had a son. He was in high school in Washington, D.C. They weren't having any more babies. They were making plans for what they would do when they had an empty nest. Now, tradition in their home was to gather around the family table. It was a rhythm, a routine, if you will, hospitality as a core virtue in their house. And one day, their son, Santi, invited a friend over for dinner. Santi's friend often came to school hungry. A friend often didn't have a safe place to spend the night. He started to come for dinner more frequently, and he would often stay over at David and Kathy's house. Now, that friend knew a friend, and they knew a friend, so that the dinner table came to be crowded with 15 to 20 high school kids every Thursday night, all of whom had undergone the traumas of poverty, homelessness, hunger, abuse, assault. And something happened. This one time, Santi invited a friend over for dinner became a once upon a time. 21-year-old woman who started coming to the dinners told David and Kathy that this was the first time she'd sat around the table to eat a meal in over 10 years. They ban cell phones at the table, be in the now, Kathy says. They celebrate birthdays and graduations. The kids read poetry they've written or perform songs they've composed. These young people have the physical needs of every young person out there, but they also have a deep spiritual need as well. You can't see it, but with the heart. Thank you for seeing the light in me, a young woman said to Kathy after they had cried together on her couch. Thank you for seeing the light in me. Like an echo, this is what the Lord has done for me when He took away the disgrace I have endured. Light shining into darkness. Hope coming out of despair. Transformation through the regular rhythms and rituals we commit to. So light your Advent wreaths. Decorate the house. Set out the tree. Put out the nativity. Go through the rituals and routines, the practices of righteousness. But be prepared to meet the divine presence even in the midst of those annual traditions. Because you never know when something you do once might break out into once upon a time.